The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. One of the great recent achievements in federal environmental policy was the passage of the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act to reform the Toxic Substance Control Act of 2016. I had concerns with that final product, but I would be the first to admit it had important provisions to help fix EPA's long-broken TSCA program. And I commend Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Pallone for their work on that historic law to make real bipartisan progress that gave EPA the tools necessary to protect Americans from toxic exposure risks. Unfortunately, EPA has chosen to ignore those tools and has, in my view, failed to implement the law as Congress intended. One of those important provisions I mentioned was a requirement that EPA consider potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations. The law explicitly identifies infants, children, pregnant women, workers, and the elderly as high-risk groups. I have many criticisms of this administration's failure to properly implement the law, but its failure to protect these groups is near the top of my list. Today, we will hear from witnesses representing workers on the front lines of toxic exposure risks, including firefighters, farm workers, teachers, and industrial workers. We will also hear about specific toxic chemicals that put working Americans at unnecessary risk on the job. Asbestos is killing thousands of Americans each year, and yet somehow U.S. imports of the substance continue to rise. EPA has deliberately excluded exposure from legacy asbestos and its disposal from the scope of its risk evaluation, leaving workers at risk of dangerous exposure. PV 29 was chosen as the very first risk evaluation under the Lautenberg Act. Last year, EPA released its draft risk evaluation and found it presented no unreasonable risk. Consideration of worker exposures were excluded from its evaluation. And methylene chloride is a paint stripper which has killed dozens of Americans. Safer alternatives exist, but EPA still refuses to ban this toxic killer. At least 4 people have died since a proposed rule was published in January of 2017. At that time, EPA proposed restricting its commercial and consumer uses, but as of December 2018, EPA appears to have abandoned the ban for commercial use, which will leave workers at risk. These are just a few substances that we will hear about today, and they are not isolated cases. If not corrected, I suspect we will see even more examples in the future because the TSCA framework rules, which were issued by the Trump administration, enable systematic exclusion of risks to workers on the job. These framework rules include the risk prioritization rule, used to identify high-priority chemicals, which allows EPA to exclude commercial uses and workplace exposures, and the risk evaluation rule, used to scope and conduct an evaluation to determine whether a chemical presents an unreasonable risk, which leaves out legacy uses and leaves open the possibility of ignoring worker exposure. This dangerous approach is not limited to the TSCA office. EPA's treatment of the Risk Management Plan rule under the Clean Air Act and the decision to allow the continued use of chlorpyrifos, a pesticide tied to impairment in children's brain development, raise serious concerns about EPA's broader efforts to protect workers. Make no mistake, we are seeing a clear pattern. The systematic failure of our Environmental Protection Agency to protect workers under TSCA and other EPA programs against the spirit and letter of the Lautenberg Act and the fundamental mission of that agency. I have met with families that have lost loved ones from exposure to methylene chloride and asbestos. Strong EPA action will not bring them back, but it can save others. That is the very least we should do for these victims. TSCA reform was not easy, but at its core, I believe those families are why we did it. EPA needed better tools to protect Americans, but today those new tools are being squandered and workers will suffer the consequences the worst. I hope we can continue to conduct oversight to ensure that EPA is protecting workers as was envisioned and required by the bipartisan TSCA reform effort. I look forward to hearing from each and every one of our witnesses. Thank you for joining us today. You will add a voice of reason, I hope, to all the work that we do. And with that, I yield back and will now recognize the Republican leader of the subcommittee, Representative Shimkus, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that you're having this hearing on chemical management, and I want to congratulate you on calling this hearing. It's you know, the Lautenberg Act passed in 2016, as the chairman had mentioned. Then you have the rules, and you got to start going through the process. And now it's time to do a look and see the good and the bad and the ugly that still pervades through the system, and to make corrective action. As one of the authors and supporters of the TSCA reform bill, we want it to work because we want it to protect, we want the EPA to do due diligence on the science of the chemicals. I think what I've learned by the process of this hearing and doing work is that there's a couple agencies that have responsibilities here, and there seems to be, especially with the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act or TSCA Reform Act, there seems to be, Mr. Chairman, some overlap that that maybe we need to keep looking at and start talking about, because we have an agency that's supposed to be in the workplace to protect and observe how chemicals are used in that processes to protect workers, and that's the, as we know, as OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, and it's hundreds of professionals. And sometimes they are trained to do the same thing that we've asked EPA to look at, especially under the TSCA reform. In fact, they might have, OSHA may have even more people in the agency on a particular process to protect workers. So we're not in the Workforce or Ed and Labor Committee, but so my expertise in that area is not as much as in what we tried to do under the Frank Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, which was focus on the EPA, find out why it takes so long, make sure that they focus on defining whether a chemical is safe or not safe. And if there are, because of the use in our society, how do we, the people who, if it's deemed that it's still needed for production, how do you, what do you tell OSHA and the people who are going to use it that they need to do to make sure they protect the workers in and around these chemicals? 98% of all things touched in this room are touched by the chemical manufacturing sector, whether it's paints or acrylics or metal and furnishings and the like. So understanding that chemical use is pervasive, I think what brought us together, and it's good to see Chairman Pallone enter, I think what brought us together was to say, let's do this right, because the system was delayed. We had old chemicals that weren't being evaluated. I'm particularly concerned about making sure we have new chemicals vetted quickly, because they may be more effective and efficient and safe. So if the EPA is not dealing with the new chemicals, and we may have some chemicals needed in the manufacturing sector that might pose some risk, wouldn't it be better to get the new chemicals onto the market? So as my colleagues on the other side know, I've been wanting to have a hearing like this since passage. You have to allow the EPA to at least set up and develop their rules. But this is the right time to do it, and I'm glad you called the hearing, and I look forward, hopefully we can have more and some more in depth, and maybe also vet out this merging of the agency's responsibilities and who's supposed to do what, because if you don't have clear, definitive, you all know, especially, if you don't have clear, definitive rules, then you don't know who's supposed to do what and who to hold accountable. So with that, again, I appreciate the hearing, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman yields back. Now the chair recognizes Mr. Pallone, chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Tonka. Today, we're here to continue this committee's critical oversight work of the Trump administration by reviewing the Environmental Protection Agency's mismanagement of chemical risks and its harmful impacts on America's workers. 2 years ago, this committee came together after years of work to pass the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act to finally reform the Toxic Substances Control Act, commonly known as TSCA. One of the most important protections included in that bill, from my perspective, was the new requirement that EPA ensure protection for vulnerable populations, including infants, pregnant women, environmental justice communities, and workers. Explicit worker protections are so essential because workers bear the brunt of chemical exposures and harm. In fact, according to the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, occupational diseases kill more than 50,000 workers in our nation every year. About a third of those cases are cancer. Globally, the UN reported last year that toxic exposures at work kill one worker every 15 seconds. To put that in perspective, by the time my 5 minutes are up, toxic exposures will have killed 20 workers worldwide. Clearly, our track record of protecting workers is appalling. Many of us who worked to update TSCA hoped it would help, but unfortunately, I fear EPA's implementation of the Act is moving us in the wrong direction. Methylene chloride is a prime example. EPA began a risk assessment on methylene chloride before we completed action on TSCA reform, and that assessment looked at workplace exposures, including numerous worker deaths. Based on that assessment, the Obama EPA proposed a complete ban on methylene chloride, and now the Trump EPA is trying to keep commercial uses in place, leaving workers at unacceptable risk. Asbestos is another serious example. Studies documenting worker deaths from asbestos exposure go back to the 1960s, and it was among EPA's first targets when TSCA was originally enacted back in 1976. When we passed the Lautenberg Act, we hoped it would fix the flaws in TSCA and allow EPA to finally ban asbestos 40 years after it began the regulatory process. But EPA is now working on an asbestos risk evaluation that ignores all exposures to legacy asbestos, which we all know is a major driver of risk. And last year, the agency adopted a significant new use rule that would allow new uses of asbestos in consumer products. EPA political leadership took this action over the objections of the nonpartisan career staff who were worried about the very real public health impacts. Because of these actions, I've lost confidence in EPA's ability to implement this law and ban asbestos. And that's why last week I joined Representatives Bonamici, Slotkin, and others in sponsoring the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act. It's long past time that we ban this dangerous substance which continues to kill American workers. The Trump EPA's attack on workers goes beyond its refusal to properly implement TSCA. The Clean Air Act's risk management planning program should play an essential role in protecting workers and communities from toxic chemical exposures, but the Trump EPA has repeatedly tried to weaken it. They've also tried to weaken farm worker protection efforts, but this Congress recently passed legislation that would prevent EPA from rolling back farm worker protections for the time being. And finally, I have to mention the unfortunate fact that workers are among those most endangered and impacted by climate change. Extreme weather and natural disasters pose serious threats to emergency responders, chemical plant workers, refinery workers, and more. The Trump EPA has repeatedly undermined national efforts to address climate change, leaving our workers and communities vulnerable to ever-worsening extreme weather. So this hearing, Mr. Chairman, I know it's just the beginning of your efforts to hold EPA accountable to the people it's supposed to protect. I hope we can work together in a bipartisan fashion to ensure EPA is meeting its statutory obligations and mission to protect human health and the environment. I know, Mr. Tonka, that you have I guess I'm supposed to, I didn't know I was supposed to give my time. Whatever I have left, I will give to Ms. Dingle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Chair. We're holding an important hearing today to examine how EPA is mismanaging its responsibility to protect the health and safety of the American worker. The American worker needs to be protected from all harmful and toxic chemicals, as every American should be. The American worker is the backbone of this country. I want to briefly recognize and thank Professor Finkel from the University of Michigan, go Blue, bad weekend last weekend, and Janine McGinnis, a retired we're going to do better this weekend, and Janine McGinnis, a retired auto worker, for testifying before the subcommittee today to share their respective expertise and their personal story. Committee can learn a lot, and I look forward to hearing from them today. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I believe Mr. Walden, Republican leader, is busy with the Health Subcommittee downstairs, so we'll proceed by reminding members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. Now we introduce our witnesses for today's hearing, and we thank you again for joining. Ms. Janine McGinnis, Benefits Representative of the United Auto Workers. Seated next to Ms. McGinnis is Mr. Patrick Morrison, Assistant to the General President for Health, Safety, and Medicine of the International Association of Firefighters. Next, we have Ms. Wendy Hutchison on behalf of the Baltimore Teachers Union. Then Mr. Give Kashkuli. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. On behalf of, as serving as Vice President of the United Farm Workers, then we have Mr. Tom Grumbles, former President of the American Industrial Hygiene Association and past President of Product Stewardship Society on behalf of AIHA. Next, we have Mr. Duval, is it? Oh, Duval, Principal of Beverage and Diamond, PC. And then we have Dr. Adam M. Finkel, Clinical Professor of Environmental Health Sciences of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. We, on behalf of the, on behalf of the subcommittee, thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide his or her opening statement. Before we begin, I would like to explain the lighting system. In front of our witnesses is a series of lights. The light will initially be green at the start of your opening statement. The light will turn yellow when you have 1 minute left. Please begin to wrap up your testimony at that point. The light will turn red when your time expires. So we'll now move to Ms. McGinnis and recognize Ms. McGinnis for 5 minutes. And again, welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Skimkus and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Janine McGinnis. I'm a FCA UAW benefit representative. I'm also a retiree, and I represent the UAW Local 1413 and 1929 out of Huntsville, Alabama. I was hired as an assembly line worker at the Chrysler plant in Huntsville, Alabama in 1983. It was a profound time in my life when I was entering the workforce for the first time. My husband had just been gotten out of the military after serving for several years, and we needed to supplement our income, so I had to seek employment. I was overjoyed to land a job that was so highly sought after in the area of our country with Chrysler Corporation, where the jobs were so scarce. It offered a decent wage and opportunity for growth, of which I quickly took advantage of and soon or later on earned a degree. Once known as the fastest growing automotive electronic operation in North America, the plant built many products that went into the Chrysler vehicles and other vehicles. When I started working there, there were approximately 2,400 employees, and it grows to 2,800 employees. It was a fast-moving plant that had different lines with large solder waves throughout the plant. Many of us became concerned due to the breathing problems we experienced related to the solder paste and the fumes that were coming from the solder wave machines. The plant was very old and very poor ventilated, and our skin was exposed to the various chemicals used in the production. There was a field adjacent to our one of the old buildings that we worked in where the ladies played softball, and our concerns were heightened when they closed the softball field and later found out that the soil was contaminated. But we continued to work in the plant that was right next to the field. In the early 1990s, we moved to a newly built plant called the Huntsville Electronic Division of Chrysler, or HEDC, and we moved to Madison, Alabama. It wasn't until we moved that the workers were provided guidelines and hazardous postings. Many had already, though, been exposed in the old plants to all the chemicals that were in those plants. While there were improvements due to unfamiliarity of the chemicals being used, we were still breathing fumes from TSCA and dust from fiberglass created from the printed circuit boards. There were 16 assembly lines in a wide open space with big solder wave machines on most of the lines. Every line had cleaning stations. These agents that were used for cleaning were to clean the residue off the printed circuit boards, and that product that we used was TCE. Chlorinated solvents like TCE were thought to be safety solvent because they would not catch on fire. As workers, we didn't understand the possible health effects of these chemicals and just focused on completing our jobs and wanting to do a good job and get it done. Now later we realized that TCE is a known carcinogen. Researchers have studied our death rate of our retirees, and they found that my coworkers have died at a higher rate than the general population of disease related to TCE and other chemical exposures, including cancer of the brain, the nervous system, as well as non-cancer nervous system diseases. A lot more could have been done to protect our workers and lessen chemical risk. Companies need to be held accountable, and more stringent legal requirements are needed to ensure that the workers are not exposed to harmful chemicals. We need to go forward and not backward to the 1970s. The Obama administration has proposed banning use of TCE. However, the Trump administration has not issued final rules on these bans. As more business and auto manufacturing jobs are coming to my region of the country, we will be faced with the same issues. Chemicals must be tested for rigorous testing, and they must be tested again and again and again before manufacturers are permitted to use these chemicals in our plants, in our workplaces. In 2016, President Obama signed the Lautenberg Act to fix the Toxic Substance Control Act. We can't afford to wait anymore. Implementation of the TSCA is a must, and it must be a top priority for the EPA and this administration to protect our workplace and our communities from untested toxic chemicals. In this great country, everyone should be able to work with the expectation that their workplace is safe, and we all should be able to enjoy our golden years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. Patrick Morrison, speaking from the International Association of Firefighters perspective. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Patrick Morrison. I'm Assistant to the General President for Occupational Health and Safety and Medicine of the International Association of Firefighters. Prior to that position, I was a firefighter for 20 years with the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department. I appreciate the opportunity to appear today before you on behalf of General President Schaeferger and over 316,000 professional firefighters and emergency medical personnel who comprise our organization. Our members face significant chemical exposures on the job due to the vast quantity of chemicals in building materials, consumer products, and the equipment our members use every day. Firefighters have put our trust in the EPA to regulate these toxic chemicals, but have witnessed only modest efforts by the current administration to protect the health and well-being of exposed workers. This is very concerning to us, as firefighters have a higher rate of certain cancers than the general population, including twice the rate of mesothelioma. Unfortunately, in the years since TSCA's passage, little progress has been made. Specifically, we are disappointed in EPA's failure to evaluate all susceptible subpopulations and address the use and disposal of legacy chemicals. We are pleased that EPA included both asbestos and HBCD, a flame retardant, as two of the first 10 chemicals to evaluate under TSCA, as firefighters are regularly exposed to these chemicals through their work. The IFF presented evidence relating to firefighters' exposure to these chemicals and the associated health problems linked to occupational exposure in response to EPA's scope of risk evaluation, document released in June 2017. These documents included firefighters as a susceptible subpopulation and included legacy uses as part of the evaluations. Unfortunately, EPA's failure to include firefighters as a susceptible subpopulation in their problem formulation document for asbestos released in May of 2018. Furthermore, EPA also removed the evaluation of both legacy HBCD and legacy asbestos, including disposal from such documents. Firefighters have high exposures to these chemicals daily as part of their occupation and should be evaluated. Additionally, according to TSCA, EPA must evaluate the entire life cycle of a chemical, from the moment these chemicals enter the market until they are disposed of. The EPA should be evaluating them through this entire life cycle. Unfortunately, removing the legacy use of asbestos and HBCD from EPA's evaluation will almost certainly skew the evaluation's results, especially as it relates to workers. The bulk of exposures to these chemicals are a result of legacy use. Further, from the firefighter's perspective, such exposures are not legacy. They are occurring today. While TSCA is among the highest profile chemical legislation that has directly impacted our members, it is not our only concern. Recently, Congress noted the dangers associated with PFAS. These chemicals are found in AFFF firefighting foam, primarily used at military bases and airports, older protective clothing, and potentially in newer protective clothing. In 2006, EPA instituted the voluntary PFOA stewardship program that resulted in reduced production of PFOA and other long-chain PFAS production by 8 major manufacturers by 2015. However, there are existing stocks of foam containing these chemicals still being used. In 2007, EPA issued significant new use rule regulating a significant number of PFAS chemicals. This effort was specific to PFAS chemicals reporting requirements and did not restrict the use of existing stocks of legacy AFFF firefighting foam containing long-chain PFAS chemicals. In 2015, EPA proposed another SNR for PFOA and other long-chain PFAS as a regulatory follow-up to the voluntary PFOA stewardship program. Regrettably, this SNR has not been finalized. We are also aware that EPA is starting to work on PFAS action plan to outline concrete steps to address PFAS and to protect the public health. Unfortunately, yet again, EPA is neglecting to look at the worker's perspective. EPA's plan addresses communities affected by firefighting foam runoff, but they are not looking at the subgroup of airport and base firefighters that are using these foams and exposed to these chemicals on a regular basis. Since there is little federal oversight in this topic to protect workers, we are taking matters into our own hand. Currently, IFF is sponsoring 3 research projects relating to PFAS, testing firefighters' blood, station dust, and turnout gear for the substance. While we are frustrated with the efforts from EPA on these issues, the IFF will continue to working with legislators and other decision makers to address our concerns with these chemicals and their use. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. We'll now move to Ms. Wendy Hutchinson on behalf of the Baltimore Teachers Union. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Wendy Hutchinson. I'm a science and health educator at Edmondson Westside High School in Baltimore, Maryland. I appreciate the opportunity to offer my perspective on the EPA's failure to protect school staff and students in our public schools. My comments will focus on 3 issues. The first is asbestos removal in Baltimore schools. In 2017, the Baltimore Sun and others reported that parents of Rosemont Elementary and Middle School boycotted the school by keeping their children home because of district plans for a roof replacement, a project requiring the removal of materials testing positive for asbestos. Contractors plan to work during after-school hours from January through June. Pursuant to state and federal guidelines, contractors were expected to take precautions to prevent particles from spreading. In addition, air samples were taken daily before students were let back into the building. Parents advocated for students to be temporarily relocated, but district leaders said that was not necessary. I share the story because my school was constructed at the same time as Rosemont, a period when asbestos was commonly used in construction. As our state's school buildings continue to age and deteriorate, too many students and school staff are being exposed to the deadly asbestos fibers. While some school districts are ignoring the obvious, other districts are simply not aware of their own hazards and the scope of work abatement requires. As I prepared for today, colleagues shared that the EPA is narrowing how the agency assesses the impact and health risks of toxic chemicals like asbestos on school employees and students. 33 years after Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act became law, far too many people are still exposed to asbestos. Virtually every expert will say there is no safe level of exposure to asbestos. Even minimal exposure can lead to significant diseases such as mesothelioma or lung cancer. In fact, a 2-year study by NIOSH found an elevated rate of mesothelioma among public school teachers whose only exposure to asbestos was at school. I have a coworker who died of lung cancer. She was in good shape, athletic, a non-smoker, and ate well. She worked for many years in a school built in 1955 that had asbestos and was not completely renovated before her untimely death. Although it is now a known human carcinogen, asbestos has previously been used in school buildings like mine, especially from 1946 to 1972. This means some 131,000 school facilities in the United States, as well as 57 million students and school staff, are potentially exposed. Next, I'd like to discuss lead in Baltimore schools. Lead testing was mandated in 2017 after a decade of banned water use in public school facilities in Maryland. Since testing began, elevated levels of lead have been found in nearly all of the 170-plus schools in the city school system. For years, city schools notoriously used plastic water bottles to provide safe water for students. But fixing the problem would mean replacing all the water pipes, costing millions of dollars per school. My school has not been renovated and is not on any list for renovation currently. I visited the city school system website and found that as the school district tries to improve school buildings, it has installed water filtration systems in some schools and upgraded plumbing in new buildings. To date, some 14 have working water fountains and clean water in their kitchens and no longer require bottled water. Finally, I'd like to share my personal experience with a combination of hazardous environmental exposures in the city school system. My fellow teachers and students understand the lack of investment in school infrastructure, particularly in schools serving many students of color, impedes learning and compromises our health and safety. How do we send children to schools with contaminated water or inadequate air quality? Too often, parents are unaware that they are sending their children to substandard learning environments. Our children and educators deserve better, and that begins with the EPA assuming full responsibility for these issues. While the EPA has authority to mandate significant protective measures to spare students and school staff from unhealthy exposure, it has generally failed to do so. Asbestos and lead are just 2 examples, but there are others. As a result, veteran educators who have been working in the same building silently suffer and are at risk for potential long-term consequences. Congress can help make school buildings safer by providing more resources for school infrastructure. In its 2017 report on the nation's infrastructure, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave school facilities a D+. It found that nearly 53% of public schools needed to make renovations or upgrades to be in good condition. That is why I'm pleased that the Rebuild America's School Act is moving forward in the House. In closing, I can only hope you understand that investing in school infrastructure will increase the health and safety of children and school staff. That is what my union, the AFT, has launched, Fund Our Future, a national campaign to secure sustainable investments in our public schools and public colleges. It is our solemn responsibility to educate our nation's future workforce in safe and healthy buildings so that all students can reach their potential.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. And now we welcome Mr. Guy Kashkouli, Vice President of the United Farm Workers, and thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Tomko, Ranking Member Shimkus. It's an honor to be here with firefighters, teachers, auto workers. My name is Guy Kashkouli. I'm the Second Vice President of the United Farm Workers. In addition to our members, we're proud to fight for the 2.5 million people who feed the 325 million rest of us in this country. Unlike the other panelists, farm workers and the control of pesticides is the one group of workers where EPA has full responsibility to enforce. Every other worker in the United States, it's OSHA that has that responsibility. There's an ugly race-based history for why farm workers were excluded from that, but we're pleased that some of that is being changed, first with EPA coverage, and also just last week, bipartisan support by Congress, including farm workers in close to full protections as all other workers as part of PREA. That's a great moment, and we hope from here going forward we can be moving forward. We want to be moving forward because of incidents like happened on May 5th, 2017 in rural California. That was a day, this is not going to be a war zone that I'm going to describe, but it was a day when a group of principally women and some men were harvesting cabbage when a noxious odor came into their senses. Some of their lips began to go numb. There was an extraordinarily awful taste in their mouth. And yet, as Ms. McGinnis mentioned, when people are needing to work and put food on their own families' plates, this group of women and men continued to work. But soon after, the headaches started to set in. Some women began to vomit. And when another woman looked across at her daughter, who was working alongside her, and saw her begin to convulse and rub her eyes, and then Birkmari, who was 37 years old, fell to the ground convulsing, mother of 3 children. None of them knew what had happened. None of them knew that day what had happened, even after going through the humiliation of being stripped naked out in the fields tried to be cleansed of that toxic chemical. So these were dangerous. They learned later that this was chlorpyrifos. Most farm workers have children, over 55% of them do. Over 150,000 farm workers are under the age of 18 themselves. And so these are really dangerous impacts. Unlike the other chemicals, pesticides are deliberately designed to harm species, including people. I want to focus specifically on the chemical, the neurotoxin chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos is acutely toxic, and prenatal exposures to chlorpyrifos are associated with lower birth weight, reduced IQ, loss of working memory, attention disorders, and delayed motor development. The women like Birkmari and Lucia and Eileen and Vicente, who I just mentioned, it turned out all had been exposed to chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos is a restricted use pesticide, and the scientific evidence about the dangers of chlorpyrifos, to quote the American Academy of Pediatrics, the science of its toxicity is unambiguous. That's a quote from their report. Here's another quote. There is a wealth of evidence demonstrating the detrimental effects of chlorpyrifos exposure to developing fetuses, infants, children, and pregnant women. In the longitudinal study on impacts done by the University of California, it was shown to reduce the IQ in children. EPA's own risk assessments of chlorpyrifos document the health risks. In 2014, they showed that the extensive body of peer-reviewed science correlated chlorpyrifos exposure with brain damage to children. It showed in treated drinking water, chlorpyrifos transforms to the more toxic chlorpyrifos oxin. In 2016, the EPA scientists showed that all food exposures exceed safe levels. All food exposures, with children ages 1 to 2 exposed to levels of chlorpyrifos that are 140 times what EPA deems safe. They concluded that there is no safe level of chlorpyrifos in drinking water. They concluded chlorpyrifos is found at unsafe levels in the air at schools, homes, and communities throughout rural America. These are devastating impacts. At least 20 incidents of exposure a year took place in California alone, where we have a better database than other states. So very simply now, EPA unfortunately overturned that and is ignoring the science, and now Congress must act. So what we ask of you, of the committee, we have a lot more detail in the written testimony, but one, for farm workers, EPA is the only enforcement mechanism, so you have oversight there. And we ask that this new rule that you passed on a bipartisan basis last week, that law gets enforced. I really appreciate Ranking Member Shimkus referencing that we passed these laws and now then there needs to be a process of enforcement. And second, we ask you to join your colleague, Representative Nydia Velasquez, in H.R. 230, which would ban the use of chlorpyrifos, which again, the American Pediatric Association has shown it's unambiguous in its impacts on children. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kashkuli. Next, we'll move to Mr. Tom Grumbles on behalf of AIHA. Welcome.
Morning. My name is Tom Grumbles. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am here to share my experience from 40-plus years as a certified industrial hygienist, practicing occupational health and safety in the workplace prior to my retirement in April 2018. In addition to my direct work experience, I spent many years working with professional organizations focused on industrial hygiene and worker protection. I am a past president of the American Industrial Hygiene Association and of the International Occupational Hygiene Association. I also was a founding board member and past president of the Product Stewardship Society. I am currently a board member of the American Board of Industrial Hygiene, the group that administers the professional certification programs for the profession. I served in leadership capacity within industry trade associations as well. Through many years of engagement in these different groups, I grew to understand the practice of industry as a whole, not just my company. What I want to describe here today is what I've seen related to safety data sheets and personal protective equipment in the workplace. This is important to me in light of recent trade journal articles questioning EPA's ability to protect workers from chemical risk and the misperception that that SDSs are not followed and have no effect. Contrary to press accounts, I believe SDSs have a critical role in the safety of workers' daily life. Based on my experience, which I believe to be pretty standard industry practice, this is what happens when an SDS for a chemical is introduced into the workplace. A hazard assessment is developed that informs the need for additional training, workplace labeling, changes in standard operating procedures, additional engineering controls, and PPE needs. And yes, SDSs are made readily available to workers. SDSs are more than just a document to be read. The SDS is a catalyst for hazard assessments that ultimately guide how worker safety and health will be achieved in the workplace. In my experience, the SDS development process for any chemical is rigorous and involves multi-tiered reviews, including research and development groups, toxicology, and transportation departments. In my view, SDSs have improved dramatically with the implementation of HAZCOM 2012 by OSHA. This standard utilized the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling to drive content and format improvements, hazard classification practices, and hazard communication through labels and, for the first time, symbols. Regarding the effectiveness of PPE used in the workplace to control exposures, OSHA regulations require that a hazard determination for PPE selection be done. In addition, the employer shall verify that the required workplace hazard assessment has been performed through a written certification that identifies the workplace evaluated, the person certifying that the evaluation has been performed, the dates of the hazard assessment, and which identifies the document as a certification of hazard assessment. The OSHA requirement creates an effective PPE selection process that is documented and verifiable. In fact, OSHA statistics dating back to the 1970s shows less than 1% of violations related to the lack of eye protection, lack of general dermal protection, and lack of or inappropriate glove use, despite the fact that these violations are relatively easy to observe by an inspector. This confirms that workers are wearing PPE and compliance with those requirements in the workplace is likely. I hope this helps inform the discussion this morning regarding the collaborative relationship between EPA and OSHA in protecting worker health and safety. Clearly, there's work to be done to get that better defined. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective with you this morning.
Thank you very much for your comments. Next, we'll move to Mr. Mark Duval of Beverage and Diamond PC. Welcome.
Thank you. I would like to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and members of this subcommittee for the opportunity to testify. I am Mark Duval, a principal in the law firm of Beverage and Diamond. My testimony relates to actions by EPA under TSCA to protect workers, particularly since enactment of the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act on June 22nd, 2016. EPA has always had worker protection among its high priorities, particularly since most of the chemicals that are reviewed under TSCA are industrial chemicals to which primarily workers are exposed or potentially exposed. But the 2016 amendments amended TSCA in a number of ways, including by making worker protection an even higher priority by requiring, as the chairman said, consideration of potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations, a term which is defined to include workers. But this obligation is to protect workers is risk-based. It does not require EPA to protect workers without regard to the particular conditions of use, i.e. on the basis of hazard alone. Instead, every risk determination that EPA makes under TSCA must consider risk in light of the applicable conditions of use, including the circumstances under which a chemical is intended, known, or reasonably foreseen to be manufactured, processed, distributed, commerce, used, or disposed of. Thinking about new chemicals first, EPA has always made and continues to make worker protection one of the key considerations. Indeed, many in industry believe that EPA goes too far, being unduly conservative in its Section 5 risk evaluations. Under the new Chemicals Review Program, since enactment of the statute, EPA has granted, since enactment of the 2016 amendments, EPA has granted 824 exemption applications. Those exemption applications come with restrictions. Each of the 824 granted applications has worker protection requirements. EPA has also imposed worker protection requirements on many submitters of pre-manufactured notices, or PMNs, in the form of an order that includes requirements for particular kinds of respirators, gloves, and protective clothing, and specific hazard communication requirements. EPA has then mostly extended those requirements to other manufacturers and processors through proposed or final significant new use rules. EPA has adopted 463 final rules that incorporate worker protection provisions and 404 final rules that incorporate hazard communication requirements. These requirements are tied to OSHA's requirements on respirators, other uses of personal protective equipment, and hazard communication. Since enactment of the 2016 amendments, EPA has made 564 final determinations on PMN substances, not counting those that were invalid or withdrawn, and issued orders restricting 441 of those, or 78% of the total. Thus, almost 4 out of every 5 chemicals reviewed in the new Chemicals Review Program is regulated, a dramatic shift from the situation prior to enactment of the amendments, when only about 1 out of every 5 that completed EPA review was regulated. EPA has also initiated or completed significant new use rulemaking for 378 PMN chemicals, or 85% of the total that have received an order since enactment of the amendments. Turning to existing chemicals, methylene chloride, EPA should any day now be publishing a final rule on methylene chloride. We will learn the nature of the final rule and its, any additional rulemaking shortly. At the moment, none of us knows what EPA, what the rule will include. Regardless of what is in that rule, EPA's actions will supplement OSHA's occupational health standards on methylene chloride, both the general industry standard and the construction standard. Those standards set mandatory requirements on permissible exposure limits, exposure monitoring, regulated areas, methods of compliance, respirators, protective work clothing and equipment, hygiene facilities, medical surveillance, hazard communication, employee information and training, and record keeping. They will also supplement EPA's NESHAP, the National Emissions Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants, for paint stripping and miscellaneous surface coatings, which require commercial paint stripping operations using methylene chloride to institute management practices, including to ensure that there is not an alternative technology that can be used, and to reduce inhalation exposure. EPA is also working on other aspects of methylene chloride. On asbestos, EPA banned most uses of asbestos in 1989, but in 1991, a court overturned that ban. That development led to enactment of the Lautenberg amendments in 25 years later. In June of last year, EPA proposed a significant new use rule for 14 former uses of asbestos. The final rule is expected this year. Once final, that rule will achieve much of what EPA's 1989 ban on asbestos was intended to achieve but could not due to the court decision. It will effectively ban many of the uses listed in the 1989 rule, as well as several others, thus preventing their recommencement without advanced EPA review and approval. EPA is also working to publish a risk evaluation for certain ongoing uses of asbestos with statutory deadlines. The scope document.
Mr. Duval, if you could wrap up, please.
I will. The short answer is EPA has much work to do, but its work will include attention to worker protection.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And finally, we move to Dr. Adam M. Finkel of the University of Michigan School of Public Health. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My bio is in the testimony, but briefly, I was OSHA's chief rulemaking official in 1995 to 2000, and later as chief enforcement official in the Rocky Mountain states out of Denver. I've been on the EPA Science Advisory Board, Board of Scientific Counselors, and on both of the National Academy Committees convened to review EPA's risk assessment methods. I'm a strong supporter of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis, having helped pioneer some of the methods EPA uses. I'm going to pose 4 questions in this brief statement, but my main message is that, as others have said, TSCA now requires EPA to provide protections to workers and requires it to use readily available information and the best available science to do so. Many of EPA's actions and inactions over the last 2 years are contrary to the plain meaning of the law, arbitrary, and unscientific. Congress needs to give EPA clear direction to follow the law it enacted and to oversee the agency's corrective actions. So question 1, why should EPA protect workers? Chairman Pallone mentioned 50,000 premature deaths per year. One might think that because EPA has been instructed by Congress to reduce risk to 1 in a million where possible, and OSHA has always interpreted its Supreme Court decision to let it stop at 1 in 1,000, that workers would be exposed to about 1,000 times more of these chemicals than the general population. But I've looked at all the data. It's actually 10,000, 100,000, sometimes 1 million times greater concentrations in the workplace than in the general environment. There's a reasonable belief that when workers are compensated and are informed about their risk, they could bear more risk than the general population. But come on, 10,000 times more? EPA should begin its risk assessment and management in the workplace because the risks physically begin there. Just as it's cheaper to put ice on a frozen sidewalk than to put a plate in a broken leg, the most efficient way to reduce concentrations for everyone is to reduce them at the source where they're highest, so they don't diffuse into the air that non-workers breathe all day and that workers breathe when they come home at night. And in many cases, businesses will find it less expensive and less illogical to control these exposures simultaneously using substitution or engineering controls, rather than having to deal with half the problem, then the other half, and retrofit. So I think EPA, both the Air Office and the Chemicals Office, should regard workers as one of their primary constituencies. EPA doesn't ignore water pollution because there's a Fish and Wildlife Service, and they shouldn't ignore workers just because there's an OSHA. Question 2, why was EPA given this statutory authority? I've read comments by ACC and the Halogen Solvents Alliance claiming that EPA must coordinate with OSHA before doing anything that might reduce worker risk. That's legally inaccurate. TSCA 9A gives the administrator complete discretion to decide when to confer. And this makes sense because for most or all of the chemical risks that EPA finds may be unreasonably high to workers, OSHA's accurate answer to the question, can you do more, would be no. And so asking the question is only going to complicate and delay needed analysis and action. I'm proud of my former agency, but it's overmatched and unable to reduce unreasonable risks. Many factors are in my testimony. Mr. Cacciulli is right that most workers are covered by OSHA, but not public sector workers, not independent contractors, not safety hazards on small farms. So there's a lot of lack of coverage, a budget 1/20th of the EPA's, 19 chemical-specific standards in 49 years compared to over 1,000 in Germany. And again, the declaring victory at 1 in 1,000, which is far above where EPA would ever even begin to contemplate starting a rulemaking. Now, we've talked about methylene chloride a bit. I've presented a graph in my testimony showing over 12,000 samples divided between pre-1999, when the standard I helped write took effect, and the 15 years later. The new PEL is 25 parts per million, but in the 15 years before we went to all that trouble to regulate, the average exposure was about 85 parts per million. Now it's all the way down to 69 parts per million. Widespread non-compliance. And that's one of 19 regulated chemicals. There are thousands more that are unregulated or used standards that were grandfathered in 1970 based on 1950s science. Question 3, how is EPA failing? I see a pattern of rather clumsily designed pronouncements designed to make worker risk go away without actually doing anything helpful. Methylene chloride, it's clear from the titles of the rules that we're headed towards a split in the rule where consumers may be protected. I'd be happy to answer questions about how I think they probably will not be, but workers will be deferred for restarting a rulemaking on an issue, certification and training, that EPA already said we view the costs and challenges of certification and training as a limitation of that approach, and they rejected it. 1-bromopropane, multi-site animal carcinogen, known human neurotoxin. We've known this now for at least 12 to 15 years. EPA has still not listed it as a hazardous air pollutant, which is only a hazard determination. And the thing I want to highlight about this, just to give you a sense of what's going on in the workplace, there is a manufactured doubt out there that says that when animals are exposed to far more than workers in the laboratory, we may have trouble extrapolating down to lower doses. But in the animal test, at 62 parts per million, the animals got 800% more cancer than the background. Workers are exposed today to at least 20% of them to over that limit. So it's above the amount that we're giving to animals in the cage. My time is almost done. I'd be happy to talk about PMNs. My fourth question was, how is EPA failing everyone else? I think the methylene chloride rule is not going to necessarily protect consumers because there are going to be small cans still available. The bromopropane rule says that consumers will avoid it because it's expensive. Again, I'm proud of OSHA, but it's not. Let's begin. Let us begin. That's what EPA should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel. That concludes the opening statements of our witnesses. Thank you, every one of the panel, for your thoughts. We'll now move to member questions, and each member will have 5 minutes by which to ask questions of our witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. We've heard from representatives of workers in 4 different and distinct industries, but each are raising similar concerns. Ms. McGinnis, Mr. Morrison, Ms. Hutchinson, and Mr. Kashuli, in your opinions, is EPA doing enough to protect workers in your line of work? And just need a yes or no answer there, and let's begin with Ms. McGinnis.
I feel like they're doing some, but they could do better, more.
Okay, so that's they're not doing enough.
Not
answer.
doing
No.
enough.
Okay, Mr. Morrison, yes or no?
Not doing enough, no.
No. Ms. Hutchinson?
No.
Thank you. And Mr. Kashkuli?
No, and they now have a new tool, and that I hope Congress will help them make sure that they use it.
Thank you. Mr. Morrison and Dr. Finkel, the Lautenberg Act explicitly designated workers as a susceptible subpopulation. Do you think that was a warranted decision for Congress to make? And if so, is EPA doing enough to live up to that statutory change? We'll begin with Mr. Morrison, please.
For our class of workers, the firefighters, I think what they failed to do was they prevented us from being that sub-worker group with the legacy asbestos. We were not considered that. We were not considered a high hazard group on that, and therefore we were excluded. So we feel that EPA has really let us down, especially around that legacy asbestos issue.
Thank you. And Dr. Finkel.
Workers are not, I mean, they're a susceptible population, but they're there because they're an incredibly highly exposed population. And in every single case where OSHA has regulated, and in every single case where OSHA has not regulated, unreasonable risk to workers, by definition, remains. So obviously I feel EPA must always consider, assess, and their conclusions, if they're scientific, should be there is unreasonable risk that we may or may not be able to deal with.
Thank you. And Dr. Finkel, in EPA's TSCA framework rules, for example, the risk evaluation rule, do you think EPA has taken sufficient consideration there to protect workers?
I've been looking more at the specifics, so the initial rules that have come, the drafts that have come out on methylene chloride and PV29 and bromopropane. They're certainly thinking about workers in those, but the idea that exposures will not be, quote, reasonably foreseen, non-use of protective equipment, non-compliance with requirements, non-compliance with guidelines, that's the definition of reasonably foreseen. So all of these attempts to say that if everything goes swimmingly and workers, instead of having clean environments or wearing respirators, all will be well, reasonably foreseen, that can't happen.
Thank you. And Mr. Morrison, same question with the TSCA framework rules. The risk evaluation rules specifically, do you think EPA has taken sufficient consideration to protect workers?
No, I really think that EPA just misunderstood our occupation. I mean,
In what way?
in that, you know, how are we exposed to, and I'm going to go back to the asbestos. How are we exposed to asbestos? How do we do it? When we arrive on a fire, when we have to fight that fire, when we have to go into that house, when we have to start pulling ceilings, when we have to make sure that that fire spread is stopped, asbestos is, in some of those cases, we're completely covered with asbestos. They didn't understand that we can't stop and do an abatement program. We're there as rescuers. We're there as firefighters. We're going to get in there. We're going to do it. But they failed to see what our job was. They needed to understand, what is that end user? What is that firefighter doing? What are the exposures? And what are the significant amount of mesothelioma that we have from a NIOSH cancer study for firefighters that show that increase, that we're not doing enough for our workers.
Thank you. We have one risk evaluation example, that being PV29. Based on how that process has gone forward under the new framework rules, I think we have some evidence of what to expect in the future. And in my opinion, it is not good. Mr. Morrison, as EPA goes forward with the other first 10 chemicals, or even future action, for example, on PFAS, are you confident that worker exposure risk will be given appropriate consideration?
Mr. Chairman, I am hoping that it is. I mean, I think PFAS right now, I'm hoping that we have a lot more detailed discussion about PFAS. It's probably the one chemical exposure for firefighters now that scares us more than anything else because of not having that protection.
Right. I think you even mentioned, right, that it was part of turnout gear, like part of the
it was part of the legacy turnout gear. We're right now, we're doing a study on the current gear to find out the current gears, what levels of that are on there for that PFAS.
Thank you. And do you or Dr. Finkel have any other suggestions on how the TSCA framework rules could better conform with the letter of the law? Either of you? Both of you?
For example, on the PV29 risk assessment, the kind of casual way that EPA talks about, well, we have some evidence that this material is not genotoxic and therefore there's no foreseeable carcinogenic risk. That's just unscientific. And again, I think the nexus between EPA and OSHA is obviously the key, both from a management point of view, but also from a scientific analytic point of view. OSHA does not require employers to follow manufacturers' recommendations on the data sheet. They often do, no question about it, but to say that there's no foreseeable risk just because there's a non-binding recommendation from a manufacturer out there, again, it might not be crazy in the management stage, but in the assessment stage where they're supposed to say, is there a foreseeable risk, that's abdication of the law, I think.
Okay, and Mr. Morrison, any suggestions quickly, because we...
Yeah, one suggestion that I think that we have to do is that we are a susceptible population. Just, what I would ask EPA is to acknowledge that. And number two is to really acknowledge the fact that legacy asbestos is an issue for us and that we have to address that. And one other thing real quickly, Mr. Chairman, PFAS, we have to look at those substitute foams that we can use as firefighters that don't put us at risk for the exposure that we are today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We now recognize, the chair recognizes Mr. Shimkus, the Republican leader of the subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We want to again welcome you here, and I want to welcome my colleagues who have joined the subcommittee. These acronyms, this science, these agencies, just hearing this testimony just tires me out. And, and I've been in this space, especially the 6 years we worked on TSCA. The Frank Lautenberg Act took us 5.5, 6 years to work through. And so I welcome my colleagues to this discussion and debate because this is just not an easy space. And so we appreciate you all being in it. For an example, it's like you have asbestos, PFAS, and PFOA, and HBC, all were really designed to help firefighters, fire retardant substances that are now
and a lot of them came on way before we even had any of these agencies, right? We had, OSHA came in 1970, actually prior to the TSCA legislation in 1976. So I always like to look back at the past to find out where we're at. That kind of explains why we got so many chemicals out there that we're trying to get our hands wrapped around, because they were in and around our use before we even started thinking, legislators, hey, we need to do something about this. So hence our movement to try to move things up, and hence the importance of this hearing. I want to go back to Mr. Grumbles and try to get this nexus of this OSHA EPA debate vetted a little bit. And I pulled it up on the iPad too. What is the role of OSHA in this process?
With this process, the PMM process?
Just the safety of the workforce safety areas that we've been discussing.
Oh, gosh, I could speak paragraphs in.
Don't, just briefly. Why do we have OSHA?
OSHA is to
Protect the workers.
implement regulations to protect workers.
Thank you. Would it be fair to say that to get a full picture of what is necessary to understand worker chemical safety, you must understand the role of OSHA and its relationship with the EPA?
Yes.
When it comes to worker protection and safety, from your experience, where has a line been drawn between EPA and OSHA authority and involvement?
So in the workplaces I worked in, EPA's presence in workers' safety and health was not much. They certainly knew EPA existed. We trained them in TSCA 80 and 8C rules because we needed their input. They knew we had permits. They knew there were operating procedures that had.
Let me ask you this thing with in line. Would you have concerns if EPA began writing its own specific worker protections standards into significant new use rules for chemicals under TSCA?
Yes, absolutely. I would just worry about the conflicts that could occur in terms of differing requirements under OSHA and what EPA would write.
Right.
And to me, that's the key issue of working out this. What does consultation with OSHA mean?
Yeah, and maybe we can help as we move forward, because I do think there's an abutment of agencies, except for Mr. Kashkula, which you noted that EPA is the sole authority under that. And I'd be interested in learning more, just the history of that too, because there should be no differentiation between how we treat our workers and how we protect them. My view. Mr. Morrison, we all love firefighters, so and so I'm trying to understand this going into the burning building, pipes still wrapped with asbestos. You don't know it's there. We get it. We can all envision this. They could even crumble and airborne. What can we do about it? I mean, so what can OSHA or EPA do about that? That's what I'm struggling with. That's my question. What can they do?
Yeah. Well, I think OSHA can do a couple things here. One is the right to know. We should have a right to know where that asbestos is when we respond to that call.
Right.
Second, I think OSHA can help us with the monitoring devices on the scene to make sure that we stay within our full protective ensemble until the air is safe or at a safer level.
Okay, so they would have a monitoring device in the facility. I mean, they're not going to get there before you guys and start putting a monitoring device.
A lot of the exposures that we have is during overhaul too. I mean, it's not just we're in there, we put the fire out, then we have to come back in, make sure the fire is completely out and extinguishing. We want to make sure that firefighters aren't taking off their SCBA.
Amen.
Prior to doing that. I mean, they can't do that. They should not do that.
Yeah, and we've seen numerous buildings torn down, and all the work that has to be done, old schools, the tiles, or the
Correct.
ceiling things, and we made great progress. But I think you made a good point. My time's expired. I want to thank you all for being here.
The gentleman yields back now. The chair will recognize Mr. Pallone, full committee chairman of E&C, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Clearly, we have some differences of opinion on the panel between the chemical industry lawyer and the impacted workers. Mr. Duval, I appreciate your testimony because it shows exactly what industry wants from EPA on worker protections under TSCA, which is, in my opinion, nothing at all. And I'm going to focus my questions on asbestos because it's very serious as a threat to workers across the economy. And we've known about its dangers for decades, but we're still importing it, and it's still present in consumer products and even cosmetics in the U.S. Mr. Duval said in his testimony that EPA's proposed significant new use rule for asbestos would finally achieve much of what EPA tried to do in their '89 asbestos ban, but it's not a ban. It doesn't apply to any ongoing uses. It only applies to a limited set of old uses, and it doesn't even ban manufacturers from resuming those uses. All it does is set up a path for EPA to review those uses if a manufacturer chooses to resume them. So in light of that, I want to start with Mr. Finkel, but most of this is just going to be yes or no, otherwise I'll never get through it in the 3 minutes here. So Mr. Finkel, do you believe that EPA's significant new use rule for asbestos is effectively an asbestos ban as Mr. Duval claimed? Yes or no?
No, I don't.
Do you think that asbestos should be banned? And do you think EPA is on track to ban it?
Hard to give a yes or no. There are different forms of asbestos, but I don't think EPA is on track to ban the most dangerous ones.
And you don't think they're going to do it, obviously.
I'm hopeful.
Okay, you're hopeful. Good. And I always like optimism.
Yeah.
And I want to turn to those on the panel who have had personal experiences with workplace hazards, including asbestos. It can be easy when we're talking about technical subjects like risk assessments and regulatory maneuvers to lose sight of the people who are impacted, but all of you should be our focus. So I really want to stress how valuable it is for us to hear from you. So I want to start with Ms. Hutchinson. Do you and your colleagues worry about your exposure to asbestos and the impact it might have on your health?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think we should continue to allow the use of asbestos in this country?
No.
And let me go to Ms. McGinnis. Auto workers have historically been exposed to asbestos in automotive parts, and asbestos is still used in brakes and clutches. Do you and other UAW members worry about the health effects of asbestos exposure?
Yes.
Do you think we should continue to allow the use of asbestos in automotive parts?
No.
Mr. Morrison, what impact does asbestos exposure have on firefighters in this country? That's a more open question.
Well, one effect it has is as the NIOSH cancer study said, that we have twice the rate of mesothelioma from exposure to asbestos in our firefighter population. And there was a study of 3 cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco. So what that is telling us is that firefighters are being exposed to asbestos at a higher rate. And right now, we have to stop that. We have to end that curve.
All right, now I have a yes or no. Do you think we should continue to allow the use of asbestos?
No.
Okay. Do you have confidence that EPA will ban asbestos under the newly reformed TSCA?
I'm going to be optimistic, too. I hope so.
Everybody's
right now, no.
Right now, no, but you'd like them to. Okay. Well, in politics, they always say the optimist wins the election, so maybe we'll take a lesson from that. Now, I just wanted to say, I have a minute left, that when we adopted the Lautenberg Act, and I will point out to my friend, Mr. Shimkus there, I think you said, 4 years? I would say more like 14 years. I mean, I remember when we were meeting with Lisa Jackson, who was the New Jersey DP commissioner, and then the administrator under Obama in the first 4 years, and you were being very optimistic. Okay, so when we adopted the Lautenberg Act, many of us in this room hoped that we were paving the way to an outright ban on asbestos, but I think it's clear now that EPA is not moving towards that ban, and that Congress will have to act directly to ban asbestos. So I hope we can work together in a bipartisan fashion, as we did on the Lautenberg Act, to move the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act and finally end the use of asbestos in this country. So I'll be optimistic as well that we can do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, and the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Washington, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank everyone for being here today and sharing your insights on this important issue. We have several different federal agencies that are involved. Our goal is to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect workers, and especially those who routinely handle all manner of potentially hazardous chemicals. and to ensure that they're able to perform their duties in a safe and effective manner. OSHA's involved, EPA's involved in guaranteeing the safety of these employees, whether it's TSCA or OSHA. I wanted to ask, and I thought I would start with Mr. Duvall, but if others want to answer too, I wanted to ask about OSHA specifically. How do you differentiate between the scope of protection for workers under OSHA and the suite of laws implemented and enforced by EPA? And what protocols exist between OSHA and EPA for sharing information and deferring to each other when it comes to exposure issues?
OSHA's jurisdiction is entirely devoted to worker safety and protection. EPA also must consider worker safety, but it also has to worry about exposures to the general population, other sensitive populations in the environment. The EPA worker protection provisions have typically referenced and built on OSHA requirements, which is appropriate. I would encourage EPA and OSHA to converse much more often and in more detail about the best ways that EPA can leverage OSHA requirements and make them effective in particular instances.
Would you speak to how information is currently shared and how they work, how we are deferring, if they defer to each other when it comes to these issues?
I spoke to a deputy administrator of OSHA last week about that very issue. He told me that EPA and OSHA meet monthly to discuss process safety issues. And when I asked him about getting together to talk about TSCA issues, he said, oh, we have met several times over the years. So I do not see a rigorous line of communication between the agencies, which I would encourage them to develop.
Mr. Finkel?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to clarify one thing that was said earlier. You know, I've worked at both agencies. Nobody likes duplication and unnecessary piling on of requirements. But in fact, for example, the methylene chloride rule, as it would have been promulgated had it looked the way it did in 2017, there would not have been a conflict. OSHA got it down to 25, not very well enforced. It's still at about 70. EPA would have banned several uses of it. That would tell a narrow swath of the industry that no more need for controls because there won't be a chemical. The new methylene chloride rule that we think is coming out will be conflicting because it's telling, it's headed towards a certification and training for workers, which is going to duplicate the OSHA certification and training. It's not going to be helpful. Okay. So just because there are two agencies involved doesn't mean it's duplicative at all.
Okay. Mr. Grumbles, some people have argued that it would be better if EPA rather than OSHA set permissible exposure levels, the PELs. Would you just speak to that question and maybe some of the concerns or practical effects of having PEL set by EPA?
Yeah, so PELs in my profession have been a struggle forever. Everyone in the process is frustrated. So we've got to find a better way to do it. Based on what's happened in the last 30 years, we have a lot of experience with how OSHA has done it, what barriers they run into, how they make their risk decisions and determine the risk exposure limit. For EPA process, there is a document that describes how they do that in the new chemical review, but I'm not sure that that process is similar enough and or is as transparent as the OSHA process. So I think we all would have some concerns if they started doing it certainly outside the new chemical notification process, but even in that process, I think it would be better to have a little more transparency on what their process is.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Morrison, I had the chance to meet with some firefighters earlier this week from Washington State. I learned about the work that you're doing on the exposure study of PFAS chemicals. I represent Fairchild Air Force Base. We've had some issues around the base, and are working right now to make sure that there's water made available and filtration systems for homes. I wanted to just ask, what is the kind of the next steps? What's the plan to conduct a health effects study to better understand whether the detections might be found are indicating disease? And I'm out of time, but maybe you can just follow up with me.
Just real quickly,
Okay.
we're actually sponsoring a bill trying to protect our federal firefighters that work on the military bases and that. One is the medical monitoring would be a blood test to try to recognize right now. What we have right now is we have to have some sort of almost a moratorium on that, on the PFAS, and look for safer substitutes. But the problem with the safer substitute is that we have to make sure it's safer. We just can't say substitute and then not really understand that. So for us right now, it's removing that stock of PFAS away out of firefighters' contamination zone and getting into something safer.
Okay, thank you. Certainly want to work with you on that, and I'll yield back. Thanks.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Representative McCutcheon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing. And to all of our witnesses, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Last week, I was pleased to host a briefing in partnership with Earth Justice to discuss some of the EPA's attacks on workers and community health protections, including the failure to adequately regulate some of the toxins we are discussing today. We were able to hear from members of impacted communities. There's no one who can better explain what is at stake or the moral imperative to change our course. I was not on this committee during its consideration of TSCA, but I appreciate the good work done by my colleagues to ensure protections for vulnerable populations, including workers in disproportionately exposed communities. Unfortunately, many workers in chemical facilities qualify as vulnerable and disproportionately exposed on two fronts. First, because of their workplace exposure, and second, because they often live around the facilities where they work. So to me, the issue of worker protection is very closely tied into the issue of environmental justice. Dr. Finkel, do you think EPA is doing enough to protect disproportionately exposed communities around chemical facilities under TSCA?
No, you're exactly right about the nexus between where workers work and where they live. I have major concerns going back 30 years about EPA's. The conventional wisdom is, you hear it all the time, EPA is very precautionary about its risk assessment. Not the case. EPA is deliberately underestimating risk to susceptible people of all kinds, workers and non-workers. So that's a constant struggle, and scientifically they're still resisting modernizing and being appropriately precautionary.
For workers in chemical plants who live near their workplaces, do you think EPA is failing them twice over? I assume from your answer that you probably do believe that.
No, I mean, they've certainly done a lot in terms of process safety along with OSHA, but in terms of chronic exposures, no.
Thank you. Mr. Kashkouli, did I pronounce that right?
You did.
All right. I also see a serious concern that workers in some areas and some industries might receive better workplace protection than some in less affluent or minority areas. You mentioned historical inequities that have left farm workers less protected than other workers in other industries. Can you elaborate on what those historical references that you make?
Thank you, Congressman McEachin, for asking that question. I know Congressman Shimkus earlier asked what is the basis for why farm workers are treated different from all other workers. So I really appreciate you asking the question and giving the time to ask. So it's an ugly race-based history. In the 1930s, when the United States passed most of our labor laws, Fair Labor Standards Act, National Labor Relations Act, and others, the principal population working as farm workers in the United States were African American. And I'm not going to use the exact words that a member of Congress used at that time, but I'm going to quote minus one word. And this is what a congressman said when they were voting on the law. Quote, "You cannot put an African American and white man on the same basis and get away with it." Was the set, and those were the reasons why farm workers were specifically excluded from all national labor laws. And that continued on to the Federal Insecticide and Fungicide Act. So that was wrong then when farm workers were principally African American. It's wrong now when farm workers are principally Latino. Fortunately, in some states, those laws are now being changed. Fortunately, last week on a bipartisan, unanimous, I should add, farm workers were finally included in an equal set of protections. It was signed into law last Friday. on pesticides, not in any other area. But we now have finally a way to move forward. I'll add that the exclusions include things like workers' compensation in many states within the United States. So thank you very much for the question.
And thank you for your expertise. And Mr. Chairman, I only have 29 seconds, so I'll give them back to you. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I hope at some point we can hear from the EPA on the issues being discussed today, and perhaps OSHA as well. EPA's implementation of TSCA, which was recently amended thanks to the bipartisan work of this committee, does provide opportunities for the agency to take steps to protect workers, as well as consider data from important federal partners like OSHA. I think having the EPA and OSHA here to really flesh out that work could be beneficial for everyone in this room today and lead to a more constructive conversation. Mr. Duvall, your written testimony mentioned TSCA Section 3, the definition there of, and I quote, potentially exposed or susceptible populations. Does that definition, as it relates to workers, only apply if EPA identifies those workers as relevant because those workers face higher than average risks of adverse health effects from a chemical's higher level of exposure?
The definition is based on EPA's discretion as identified by the administrator. So it's appropriate for the administrator to consider particular groups of workers rather than all workers if all workers are not affected. Firefighters might be a perfectly appropriate group of workers to focus on, but since EPA has so much to do and so many areas to look at, it's appropriate for EPA to select the areas where it can be most effective under TSCA in protecting the different groups that it must address.
Okay, well, following on to that, does TSCA, particularly Section 6, give the EPA discretion to choose whether and which workers will be the subject of a chemicals risk evaluation?
Again, EPA has discretion, and the key area where that discretion is addressed is on the conditions of use that will be addressed in the scope of a risk evaluation. That's where the legacy uses issue arises. The EPA must consider workers and the other areas that it has responsibility for, but the reality is that EPA has so much to do that it cannot effectively do its work if it tries to do everything for everyone.
Okay. Does TSCA authority preempt OSHA authority?
It does not. Section 9C of the Act specifically states that EPA actions under TSCA do not preempt OSHA actions. I believe that's an indication that Congress always intended EPA and OSHA to work together on worker protection rather than to have EPA supersede OSHA.
Okay. Does TSCA Section 5F5 require EPA to consult to the extent practicable with OSHA in evaluating workplace exposure issues in new chemicals?
Yes, there is a specific direction for EPA and OSHA to talk to each other. They have done so to some degree. It's not been very transparent. I would encourage better and more transparent communication.
Okay. And does TSCA Section 9A address EPA deferring to the laws of other federal agencies that might prevent sufficiently addressing an unreasonable risk determined by the administrator?
It does. Under Section 9A, EPA under TSCA must consider the ability of other federal agencies to regulate the same issue. Section 9B requires EPA to think about other EPA programs that can effectively address the same issue. There is a procedure prescribed in those, particularly in 9A, which is a little clunky in my view. I think it's best read as encouraging discussion and an open mind as to which is the best authority for addressing a particular issue.
Okay. Your testimony also states that, and I quote, TSCA is not a particularly good statute for addressing asbestos remediation and disposal. Why is that?
The 1989 rule on asbestos similarly did not address remediation and disposal. It had to do with ongoing uses of asbestos. Since 1989, many ongoing uses have been discontinued, and the significant new use rule is intended to prevent those discontinued uses from resuming. In a separate activity, EPA is doing a risk evaluation on current ongoing uses. For the in-place asbestos that's been there in buildings from the 1920s onward, EPA the TSCA statute, as opposed to, say, the RCRA statute, just is not well structured to focus on the kinds of demolition controls that the OSHA standards and the NESHAPs on asbestos and that 50 state asbestos abatement statutes address in extraordinary detail.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Mr. Duvall. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and for convening this hearing as well on this important topic. And also thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony. I hope we can all agree on both sides of the aisle that worker safety should be a top priority at EPA. Thanks to the bipartisan work of this committee, Congress has made major strides updating our nation's toxic chemicals laws to reduce environmental health risk for all Americans. But reforming those statutes is only the first step. It will require a commitment of time and resources from the executive branch to implement those changes and protect workers. President Trump's budget released earlier this week falls short. What little detail we have raises alarming concerns that environmental programs will be cut to pay for props. Even in areas where we should agree, the budget falls short. And I want to focus on one example relevant to today's hearing. The President's budget for EPA pledges to, quote, support healthier schools and create safer and healthier school environments for American children. This is something that we all can support. But even here, the administration is ignoring worker risks. There is no mention of workers responsible for renovating and maintaining schools, the janitors who use chemicals to clean those buildings daily, or the teachers who work in the same potentially hazardous classrooms for years. I have a set of questions that I wanted to ask Ms. Hutchinson, and I'll start off with the first one. Do you believe that safe and healthy schools should be a part of our infrastructure work this Congress?
Absolutely.
And should we ensure that school infrastructure improvements address occupational risks to teachers and other school workers?
Yes.
And what would you say are the most important occupational hazards to address as we work to improve our school infrastructure?
Well, I definitely think asbestos is at the top of the list, and also the water. So we bottle water in for drinking, but we still wash our hands. And I don't have research to support this, but we still wash our hands. And every once in a while, you might forget and wash a utensil that you use to eat with. I don't know what happens in the cafeteria. Again, we don't cook much food, so I'm not sure how that's problematic. But then there are other things that may seem very trite, like the temperature in schools, the infrastructure of the school that I work in. The windows blow out, it's cold, it's hot, depending on what the weather is. And then the other thing that's not very pleasant to think about is the infestation of rodents, mice, roaches, rats. You know, this building is extremely old, and while it houses about 850 students and maybe 75 educators and maybe 25 additional workers, that's a lot of people to keep everything spotlessly clean. But if we had a new, updated, modern building, students would act different, faculty would act different, and we would, you know, have a nice space to learn in.
Thank you. Dr. Finkel, in the last series of questions to Mr. Duval, I was curious to hear your take on what you believe the roles of the EPA and DOL, specifically OSHA, are or should be.
Well, again, I've been in both places. There is, I agree, untransparent but frequent communication. I'm in favor of more of that. The problem really is that for long last, Congress said in this law that unreasonable risk, which has always in EPA's purview been more aggressive than at OSHA's, again, one in a million towards that level versus 1 in 1,000. EPA now has a new responsibility to look around and see if there are unreasonable risks to workers. And I will say again, this is my expertise, every risk to workers that OSHA has dealt with and every one they have not dealt with leaves behind unreasonable risks. So EPA has a job to do, at least a job to consider. And so the idea that this is going to be solved by deferring to an agency that has reached the limits of its ability is crazy talk. I'm sorry.
And one other question I had, I know historically there was an MOU between Department of Labor and EPA. Can you give any insight on MOUs?
Well, there were many in my time in the late 90s, early 2000s, obviously about farm workers, field sanitation. I actually crafted one with EPA in North Carolina about the maximum achievable control technology standards for the AIR program, that we would get more of a chance to look at those and make sure that, in fact, some of the controls that EPA was ready to propose for stack emissions were not actually pushing the material back into the workplace and hurting workers. So we have a history of doing that. I have no idea how that's going, you know, without a head of OSHA right now.
Great, thank you. And I know I only have no seconds, but MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, just don't like to speak in jargon. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I turn back over.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Carter, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is extremely important. I have to admit to you that I get somewhat frustrated by some of the answers. I get confused as to whether it's EPA or OSHA or who's responsible, and particularly when it comes to these chemicals. And look, everyone up here wants a safe community. Everyone up here wants a safe working place. And I know all of you too as well. And whoever's responsibility it is, we need to make sure they're doing it. So I'm a little bit frustrated by some of the responses I'm getting. Not that it's your fault, and I'm not frustrated with you. I'm frustrated that it's not clearer, and that's just, I'm just a little bit frustrated by that. Mr. Duval, it appears to me that really this hearing has been really focused on how EPA has not responded or acted upon some of the regulatory actions from the past administration. And I'm just interested about the jurisdiction. Does EPA and OSHA, do they overlap and have similar responsibilities under various laws when it comes to some of these chemicals?
There is, they both have responsibility for worker safety. OSHA's only responsibility is worker safety. Worker safety is one of several priorities for EPA. They have different tools in their toolboxes. They have different statutes. OSHA's statute is well designed for setting permissible exposure limits and both chemical-specific restrictions on how chemicals can be safely used in the workplace and the kinds of backstop provisions which are important to protect workers. EPA's statute is different. Section 6 was amended in 2016. It had not been functioning for a full 25 years. And we are only now learning how EPA will implement Section 6. And I think we need to give it some time. It's learning as it goes. But I can tell you that EPA is working extremely hard on worker protection and other aspects of its existing chemicals program under Section 6. Under Section 5, EPA has responsibility for reviewing individual chemicals that are developed through R&D and are proposed to be commercialized.
Okay, let me ask you this. Can we make it any clearer? Do we need to make certain distinctions between the responsibilities of the two bodies here?
I think the responsibilities are clear in the statutes already.
So, first of all, Dr. Finkel, you want to respond to that?
Well, I like what he just said. I think the responsibilities are clear. OSHA sets permissible exposure limits. I don't think they've done a great job. It's partly my responsibility that I didn't fulfill. But EPA is now tasked with looking at uses and making hard decisions about whether certain uses are so unnecessary because of better substitutes, or if they're so dangerous that some uses should be banned, not only for workers, but for the people who breathe what the workers let out the door at night. So I don't see any lack of clarity or duplication there. OSHA's done the best it can with methylene chloride, and it's EPA's job to ask the question, should we do more? If they decide to do more, Congress has now given them the ability to do that.
Okay, I've got just about a minute left. Help me out here. Dumb it down for me. I don't know the difference in 5 and 6, Mr. Duvall. I'm sorry. I probably should, but I just don't. So what can we do? What can we do better? That's our responsibility, is set direction to these agencies. Tell me what we can do to OSHA and EPA to make sure that we've got the safest working environment that we can have for our community.
I'd say that one of the most important things that could be done is to fully fund both agencies. OSHA in particular is underfunded and needs more.
Okay, aside from funding. I saw that coming. Seriously, 30 seconds left. Anyone?
My sense is that EPA should work more closely with OSHA to get the best worker protection measures that are appropriate under their respective.
Everybody agree with that? Mr. Morrison?
Yeah, I think what we're finding right now is, like, on the fire departments, your fire departments in your area, they're governed by recommended practices. They're NFPA. We would like OSHA to work with EPA to make these rulemaking process that the firefighters are protected on that. And that relationship, I don't see why it could not work, and it should work. EPA and OSHA working together to protect the workers on the, out there.
Dr. Finkel?
Yeah, I've got a suggestion. Before I retire, I would love to see the beginning of a conversation that OSHA does a great job with worker safety, but not as great with worker health. There should be one national agency dealing with chemicals that go out of the workplace into the environment. Whether it's at EPA or OSHA, I don't care, but the separation is the problem.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Representative Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this, this hearing. Oversight of the Lautenberg Act is long overdue. I'm very concerned about that implementation of the act has veered from congressional intent, putting vulnerable populations at work. Certainly we've heard about firefighters, but you also mentioned about students, particularly low-income students of color, places that are low-income with asbestos and lead in the water, which is also true, by the way, in Illinois, where we've seen that in Chicago. I am particularly concerned about implementation of the changes to the new chemical program, which were intended to ensure that moving forward, all new chemicals had a finding that they were safe. Ensuring that new chemicals are safe is essential to addressing regrettable replacements, where one toxic chemical is being phased out just to replace it by another analogous and equally toxic chemical. Importantly, the Lautenberg Act blocked EPA from finding a chemical safe if it poses an unreasonable risk for a vulnerable subpopulation such as workers. Mr. Duvall noted several new chemicals that EPA allowed on the market despite finding serious risks based on an assumption that persons are that personal protective equipment would be used. So, Mr. Finkel, is this assumption reasonable? I think you mentioned that it's going to go, or someone did, about going along with the personal protection is not reasonable.
It's certainly not reasonable in the early stages, the way EPA has sort of waved their hands and made it go away. They're supposed to look for unreasonable risk under reasonably foreseeable conditions. And to me, as a former enforcement official, the non-use of respirators and PPE, or the non-requirement that it be, is the most foreseeable thing possible. Now, after they find that there's unreasonable risk if you don't use all this equipment properly, if they want to do something more to see that that actually happens, that's one thing. But at the get-go to say all is well because there's some guidance document somewhere that tells the workers to put on this mask that does or doesn't work is abdication.
Are the workers required to know about this as well, or is it just the person that's in charge implementing the rule?
No, the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard does require the employer to make available all these data sheets to the workers. So they're supposed to be informed, but it doesn't do them any good if the mask that they're wearing is not appropriate, if it's not fit properly. They can complain, and there's a whole history of how that goes.
All right. It seems to me that if EPA is relying on personal protective equipment to address the risk to workers, it should impose requirements for the use of such equipment. But my understanding, and from what you've said, that it may or may not be. So is this an enforcement issue?
Yes, but I do want to say I'm not trying to suggest that I think EPA should get into the personal protective equipment business. OSHA has always said, with good reason, that it's the last line of defense. So EPA should be in the engineering control and the use ban business, which it is if it was doing what it's supposed to do. EPA should not be in the business of saying, we're going to protect workers by respirators and gloves. They should be assessing what the degree of protection is.
So is this again the problem of the dual agencies and conflicting or at least misunderstood jurisdiction?
Again, I don't think so. I think Congress intentionally gave EPA some new tools that OSHA simply doesn't have, and EPA should use them.
Okay. Mr. Duvall, you cited some statistics in your testimony regarding the new chemicals program, but they seem to gloss over the major change EPA made in July 2018 to speed up the new chemicals program. So, Mr. Duvall, does the statistic you give for the number of new chemicals allowed onto the market based on a, quote, non-likely to present an unreasonable risk, unquote, finding distinguish between the period before July 2018 and the period after?
The number of not likely to present determinations is only after June 2016.
You're shaking your head, Dr. Finkel.
Prior to June 2016, EPA did not make a determination that a chemical was not likely to present. It simply decided that it could not make a finding that the chemical may present an unreasonable risk, and having decided not to make that finding, the chemical was allowed onto the market.
Unfortunately, I have my time. Oh, no. Yeah, my time is up. Sorry.
You said 2018 and he said 2016. That's why the answers are different. 52 of the last 65 since 2018 in July have been no significant risk. So it's changed very much, as you suggested.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative McNerney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and the ranking member for working together on this issue. I appreciate that. I thank the panelists, too. Especially Mr. Morrison. I appreciate the firefighters taking initiative on some research efforts. We should be doing that, and we're not, so you're stepping up. I appreciate that. And Mr. Kashkoulis, your story about the farm workers hits home. I have an ag district in the Central Valley. We don't do cabbage, so that wasn't my district, but we do have farm workers, and they put their lives on the line to feed us. And it's something that we need to appreciate more and give them more protection. So I appreciate your participation today. There are over 84,000 chemicals on TSCA inventory that should be assessed and regulated under the existing chemical program. Now, while working on the TSCA reform, we heard extensive testimony about the problems with existing chemical program. Unfortunately, it seems that many of the problems remain more than 2 years after the passage of the Lautenberg Act. Mr. Finkel, how many chemicals has the EPA required to be tested under Section 4 since we passed TSCA reform here?
Hoping to defer to somebody else on that one. I don't know that answer. None. Okay, that's why I didn't know.
We also heard testimony about abuses and claims about confidential business information. Mr. Finkel, is that a problem that's been solved?
No, my understanding is there are a couple of new EPA assessments where they talk about health studies being, case reports on EPI studies inside of workplaces being CBI, and I think that's a problem. I gather they've just released something that says that may have been a mistake, and now they're saying it was because it was a foreign workplace, but no, this stuff should not be, it can be redacted, but the health information is essential.
Okay, so that's not very encouraging either.
No.
One of the central flaws with TSCA that we determined was that the chemicals were based, evaluated on a risk standard, which was cost-benefit, basically. And so that was changed with the Lautenberg Act. The statute is now crystal clear that the EPA cannot use cost-benefit analysis and has to use risk-only analysis, and I think that's an important advancement. But under this regime, cost considerations are supposed to be reserved until after the risk evaluation is complete, but at this stage, an EPA has not even reached any of the first 10 chemicals going through the existing chemical program. So we're telling them not to use cost-benefit, use only health risk, but of the 10 chemicals, not a single one has been evaluated. Mr. Finkel, do you think the EPA has implemented this statutory requirement, or do you see non-risk factors coming into the consideration?
Well, they're certainly not on track to finish what they need to finish by end of this calendar year. They'll probably ask for an extension, but I don't think they're going to make that either. I don't see cost coming in necessarily, but I think what we've been talking about, the reliance on compliance with guidance documents is basically they are not doing their job to think about reasonably foreseeable exposure, which is the basis of where the risk comes from. So you're right that we haven't seen them try to use cost yet, but they're trying not to even have to get there by saying that there are no unreasonable risk when there clearly are.
Thank you. Do you think the EPA is implementing the existing chemical program as required by the Lautenberg Act?
Well, it's not promising so far. They had, in my view, a perfectly reasonable, long overdue proposal on methylene chloride, and now it's being split in half and sent back to the drawing board. They had a proposal to put 1-bromopropane on the HAPS list, and it's sitting in limbo, so no.
Have you heard of the term chemical trespass?
Yes.
Would you explain it?
I'm going to have a hard time with that because I've heard it in different ways, and I don't want to get into a sort of a pejorative. If you could just maybe rephrase it for me a little bit.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, is the EPA making any progress to reduce the threat of chemical trespass, and as the passage of the Lautenberg Act help at all?
I may have to defer. If you're talking about incursions into chemical plants where there's a security and safety?
No, I'm talking about just general exposure to chemicals in the general environment. I mean, we're all exposed to chemicals that weren't here in the environment 100 years ago.
No, he set me straight about biomonitoring, and that's a tough issue with privacy and autonomy issues. But yeah, we need more data on the body burdens of chemicals in the environment that are getting into both workers and non-workers. And for some good reasons, but for some delay and obfuscation, EPA is not moving fast enough on that.
Thank you. I'm going to yield back and look forward to additional oversight on these issues, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado for Representative DeGette for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for having this hearing. The chairman and I were both part of the team that helped work on the much-anticipated and long-delayed reauthorization of TSCA. But when we did that, we thought that the EPA would actually act to enforce the law. So that's why it's good. I know Mr. Shimkus thought they would too. And so that's why I think it's really good that we're having this hearing today. I want to ask about just a couple specific issues, since I know many other members have asked questions. When EPA Administrator, then Administrator Scott Pruitt appeared before this committee in December 2017, I asked him when we could expect to see a final ban of methylene chloride. He had no answer for me then, but last year, after meeting with some of the families of people who were killed by this potent toxic chemical, the Secretary committed to finalizing the ban. So now, fast forward 2 years later, it's 2019. The ban still has not been finalized. It was reported yesterday that we might see a final rule from EPA on methylene chloride this week. But from what we can tell, commercial uses will not be banned. So I've got to say, I think this is an extraordinary disservice to dozens of workers who've been killed by commercial uses of this chemical. Dr. Finkel, how dangerous is methylene chloride?
It runs the gamut. As you say, it's acutely toxic. It can asphyxiate people in bathtubs and in other settings. We did a case where somebody poured a small container on a squash court, if you know how big that is, closed the door, and was overcome by fumes in a gigantic cubicle area from one can. It's also a carcinogen, and it's also a neurotoxin. So we did the best we could. I did the best I could 20 years ago, and we're waiting for the next step.
Right. In your view, should the next step include banning commercial uses of methylene chloride?
Well, not necessarily all, but certainly the ones that were proposed 3 years ago, yes. Paint stripping, coating removal, that's where the substitutes exist, and the dangers are apocalyptically high.
Do you think that OSHA regulations are sufficient to protect workers from this substance?
The number of acute fatalities has gone down slightly, but again, we can't cover independent contractors, public sector employees, and we did the best we could for the carcinogenicity, but the 25 ppm limit is way, way too high.
And do you think that if the current commercial uses of methylene chloride continue, that customers will be protected?
I have to see how they come up with this splitting of the rule. The original rule said at least consumers would be protected because it would no longer be sold in quantities in containers less than 55 gallons. If they go back on that in order to make it easier for commercials, then essentially consumers are just where they were, except that thank goodness Lowe's and Home Depot have done the right thing and said you can't buy it.
They did it on their own.
Yeah, on their own, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I want to ask you now about 1BP, bromopropane. I'm just going to call it BP. How dangerous is this substance for workers and the general public, Dr. Finkel?
Sorry to say, more dangerous than methylene chloride. It is a carcinogen. It is a neurotoxin at lower levels than methylene chloride, and we knew about it just barely in 1997 when we finished that rule, but we had no idea that it would be as aggressively touted as a substitute that it has been ever since.
And do you think the EPA is meeting its obligations under the Clean Air Act and the Lautenberg Act with respect to this chemical?
Absolutely not, and it goes back beyond the last 3 years as well.
Okay, do you think that Nancy Beck, who's currently the Deputy Assistant Administrator with responsibility for the Lautenberg Act, should recuse herself from decisions regarding 1BP?
Well, I called for that in written comments to the agency on this docket. I've read her testimony before she came to EPA, and it is one erroneous sentence after another trying to exculpate this chemical from what we already know about it. It's inappropriate.
Thank you. Thank you. And I also want to thank all of our representatives of working people for coming here today and talking to us about what's happening in the workplace. You know, folks, it's like Ms. McGinnis said. People are just trying to put food on the table for their families. Several other of our witnesses said that, and sometimes they can't affect what chemicals they're dealing with in the workplace, and so that's why we have the EPA, because they're supposed to enforce the laws on a science-based effort for everybody, and we're going to make sure that happens. So thanks. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the very patient gentleman from Florida, Representative Soto, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On January 3rd of this year, a Tampa Bay Times headline read, "Florida officials delayed telling residents about tainted water," email showed. Linda Lawson thought little of drinking the water from the decades-old well in her backyard less than a half a mile down the road from the Florida State Fire College in Ocala. That changed when her daughter-in-law answered to state workers knocking on her door one morning, or one afternoon. They came to test the water, a worker said. In August, our local DEP in Florida confirmed that flame retardants containing PFAS and PFOA had been used by the Fire College in the past. In early September, the college was told only to drink bottled water. It took 4 months for state officials to notify the community, and recently 6 former employees of the Fire College have joined a class action suit. Obviously, we want to be proactive on this issue. Mr. Morrison, is the EPA actively pursuing PFOA and PFAS risks to firefighters and the community at large?
No, I do not think that they have really stepped up to the plate to do that. And just in full, just to add, my brother was a firefighter. He was at that academy. He actually taught at that academy. He actually has kidney cancer, but he actually was suffering from that. And what we have right now—
I'm sorry to hear that, sir.
But thank you for addressing this. But I think what EPA has not done is that they have not looked at the seriousness of what is caused, not only for the workers there, but for the drinking water in that.
I recently had an op-ed in our local paper discussing an attack on science that's a threat to our water. And a PhD, Deeptha K. Warsingi, said a systematic pattern of undermining science is occurring at the federal level at the EPA, and that vulnerable communities face disproportionate burdens of health and environmental justice. Dr. Finkel, would you agree that there's a systematic pattern of undermining science at the EPA currently, and that it does disproportionately affect vulnerable communities?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say I agree with that. Obviously, it doesn't permeate all the way through to the career levels and affect all programs, but what we're seeing in terms of the climate change program and what we've been talking about today, I don't have time to talk about it, but in my written testimony, there's some profoundly unscientific things being said about these chemicals by career and by political officials at EPA.
Give us a little flavor of what you mean by profoundly unprofessional.
Well, I'm going to single out Bill Wareham, who is the new head of the Air Office. About a month before he was confirmed in that role, this hits me hard in terms of being a former OSHA official. He was an attorney advocating against the OSHA silica standard, which was upheld in the DC Circuit. And he said, among other things, quote, "People live in dusty environments all the time and it doesn't kill them." So fundamental misunderstanding of what risk is, and a fundamental disdain for the people who work in this country. It's hard to shock me these days, but that really shocked me.
Thank you, Dr. Finkel. My next questions are for Ms. McGinnis, Ms. Hutchinson, and Mr. Kashkool. My constituent goes on to say that the EPA and the administration is stacking science advisory groups and hollowing out agency positions on monitoring enforcement. We'll start with Ms. McGinnis and go down the line. Do you believe this is happening, and how does this affect workers?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you?
Do you believe that the administration and the EPA is hollowing out agency positions in monitoring and enforcement, and how is this affecting workers?
I don't really know how to answer that. I will pass.
Okay. Ms. Hutchinson, would you say that there is a hollowing out of agency positions in monitoring and enforcement, and if so, how would that affect workers?
I'm not so sure how to answer that as well. I just know that the things that happen in schools are not communicated. So I would guess to say no.
Okay, let's simplify the question. So if there were less folks in monitoring and enforcement at the EPA, would that affect workers in general, Ms. McGinnis, at UAW and other facilities?
I think so, yes.
And how so?
Well, you have less hands in the fire, so you have less people making the decisions on what is acceptable and what is not. I don't know
And-
if that answers it or not.
Sure. And under the more simplified version of the question, Ms. Hutchinson, do you have anything to add on behalf of our team?
I would agree.
And Mr. Cashcool, do you believe that there is a hollowing out of agency positions on monitoring enforcement? And even if you don't, should that actually be true, would that affect our farm workers and how?
So yes, it'll impact farm workers, and I can answer the question. EPA right now is not listening to the scientists that they do have. Career scientists, both in 2014 and 2016, were very clear that chlorpyrifos is toxic and reduces the IQ for children. It's the same finding that scientists found for everybody else back in 2000. It was prohibited use for everyone but agriculture. And so in rural areas now for the last 19 years, scientists have now conclusively shown that it reduces IQ for children. And so EPA, the current EPA, is not listening to the staff that they do have on.
My next question is for
sorry,
Dr.
one other.
Riegel. Sorry, my time is limited, sir.
Yep.
Do we see a hollowing out of agency positions, career EPA officials, and what effect is that having?
I've read about it. I certainly have to look at next year's budget to see how much worse it's going to get. I can certainly say that's happening at OSHA, which has no head and which has reduced its enforcement. So these are the overmatched people who are trying to get to 8 million workplaces with 2,000 people, and now they're down to, I think, 1,650, something like that.
So it's safe to say that in EPA and OSHA, we're not given sufficient staff, and therefore enforcement at a level that's appropriate is not happening right now.
No, and it hasn't happened in a while. That I was not expecting to see so little progress in enforcing the methylene chloride standard that I helped write, as I have found.
My time has expired.
The gentleman yields back. That, I believe, concludes the list of colleagues looking to question the witnesses. We thank you again for participating in what is a very important topic. I request unanimous consent to enter the following into the record. We have a letter from the Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization, a statement from the Environmental Defense Fund, a study published in Environmental Health Perspectives, a report by the Government Accountability Office entitled Multiple Challenges Lengthen OSHA's Standard Setting. We have a letter from the International Union, UAW, comments by the International Union, UAW, on EPA's proposed changes to the Risk Management Program. We have a letter from the Chlorpyrifos Alliance to USDA, Secretary Perdue and EPA Administrator Wheeler, a fact sheet on the use of chlorpyrifos in agriculture, a letter from the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, PREA Coalition, a letter from the Safer Chemicals Healthy Families Coalition, a letter from Alexandra DePolito Dunn, Assistant EPA Administrator, a letter from Tosca New Chemicals Coalition, NCC, a letter from Ricky Ott with the ALERT Project, a report by the Government Accountability Project entitled Deadly Dispersants in the Gulf, Our Public Health and Environmental Tragedies, the New Norm for Oil Spill Cleanups. We have a list of public comments submitted by the Government Accountability Project on EPA's proposed rule to Subpart J of the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan that governs the use of dispersants. We have a photo documentation of dispersant contamination, and finally a testimony from Dr. Ricky Ott on the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We ask unanimous consent that they be incorporated into the record.
Mr. Chairman, reserving the right to object, I think the committee staff are working to reconcile some of this stuff, so I don't think in the end we will, but if I can reserve that right and we can visit that in the near future, I would appreciate it.
Right. The gentleman asked to reserve, and that request is granted. With that,
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
May I just, I also want to thank you all for being here. This for the layman, this is just a very challenging, difficult process. So your expertise. Dr. Finkel, I didn't want to object or intervene in your answering, but you skated closely to impugning the intent and the work of Mr. Bill Worm. He doesn't have the right to defend himself at this time, and I would caution you not to do that.
Well, I was asked a question, and it's on the public record that he said that.
Unless the chairman wants to give you time, I'm just making that statement as an observation.
Fair enough.
And I ask our Republican leader again to review two more submissions into the record. We have from the Gainesville Sun an opinion via a letter that's entitled "Attacks on Science Are a Threat to Our Water." And then finally from the Buzz, Florida officials delayed telling residents about tainted water, emails show.
Again, we'll reserve and put it in the package, and my expectations will all be good.
Thank you. The request to reserve is granted. I would like to thank, again, the witnesses for their participation in today's important hearing. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. And at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Very good. Thank you, James.